You're a very successful entrepreneur, a very successful investor. You're maybe in your golden years and you're thinking, what's going to happen to my estate after my passing? What taxes are my children and grandchildren going to be exposed to? And I'm a US citizen, or maybe I'm a former US citizen. If you're interested by this topic, then stay tuned. Hi, my name is Javier Correa, and I'm a research and development associate here at Nomad Capitalist, where we help 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs, investors, go where they're treated best, optimize their taxes, and more frequently than you might think, that also involves a certain degree of estate tax planning. As we start working with older gentlemen and older ladies as well, who are in their golden years and who are increasingly worried about the overreaching arm of governments and what that might look like and what implications it might have for their children and their grandchildren who will be potentially inheriting their wealth. So today I wanted to address those topics and talk a bit about that with a focus on the United States. So this video is for all my US citizen friends out there, as well as former US citizens. There's going to be a special section for you, so stay tuned. So the first thing we have to do is distinguish between what is an estate tax and what is an inheritance tax. And often the two are confused and people tend to use the terms interchangeably. However, this is a mistake. So estate taxes are taxes that are levied upon the estate of a deceased person after their passing. So the tax is applied at the estate level, and the person who is in charge of paying the tax is the executor of the estate. So let's say John Smith passes away. He leaves $100 million. His executor has to pay all the necessary taxes. Once those taxes are paid, then all assets within the estate then are transferred over to, let's say, John Smith Jr., his son. And his son, John Smith Jr., does not have to pay any form of estate tax because it simply does not apply to him. The estate tax applies at the estate level after the passing of the individual, and it does not subject the heirs to any type of fiscal obligation. On the other hand, inheritance taxes, which I would say are far more common, inheritance taxes are levied on the heirs of the deceased. So again, in the same example, let's say John Smith passes away. He lives a $100 million estate. The estate would immediately go to his son, John Smith Jr., and then John Smith Jr. would be liable for inheritance tax upon receiving the ownership of the assets. So completely different to estate tax, even though very similar. Now that we've cleared that out of the way, let's talk about the US situation in particular. Like many things in the US, we have to take into consideration both the federal level and the state level. So at the federal level, the good news is there is no inheritance tax. Let me say that again. There is no inheritance tax at the federal level in the United States, meaning that in most cases, with a few exceptions, and this is for former US citizens, and we'll get to that in a sec, but generally speaking, if you are a US person, you are only subject to US estate tax, and you will not be subject to any form of US inheritance tax at the federal level. In addition to the federal estate tax, if you are a resident of one of the following states, Iowa, Kentucky, Maryland, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Nebraska, you do have to worry about inheritance taxes at the state level. Furthermore, if you are a resident of any of the following states, so Maryland, New York, Vermont, Illinois, Rhode Island, Maine, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, the District of Columbia, or Connecticut, you also have to worry about estate taxes at the state level. So, to circle back to that again, at the federal level, you only have to worry about estate taxes, no inheritance tax, and at the state level, if you're in one of the 6 states I mentioned in the first section, then you have to worry about inheritance taxes at the state level. If you're in one of the 13 states that I mentioned in the second group, then you have to also worry about estate taxes at the state level. If you live in a tax-free state like Florida or Texas, then you only have to worry about taxation upon your passing at the federal level. What does this mean in practical terms? This means that, for example, let's say you're a US citizen and somebody leaves you a piece of property or leaves you some assets that are located overseas or even in the United States proper. You are not required to pay any inheritance tax as a US citizen that is receiving the assets. Let me say that again. You are not required to pay any inheritance tax as a US citizen, green card holder, or simply somebody who's residing in the United States and who meets the substantial presence test, provided that you are inheriting under what I quote unquote would call regular circumstances. So that's number one. Now, in terms of the tax rates applicable to estates. So obviously most people are famous with the 40% number, right? 40% is the number that scares everyone. So the good thing to note here is that if you are a US citizen or a US green card holder or somebody who is domiciled in the United States, keep in mind that the estate tax is applicable to those who are domiciled in the US, not necessarily resident for income tax purposes. So the criteria is slightly different, but I won't get into much detail into that in this video. In most cases, so again, US citizens, green card holders, you are the beneficiaries of a lifetime exclusion of over $13 million as of the filming of this video. Do keep in mind that the Trump Tax Cuts and Jobs Act will expire soon if it's not extended by Congress, which means that potentially that lifetime exclusion is going to go down to about half. I believe after 2025, so we do have to keep an eye out to see what Congress does with that. But as of now, you benefit from this very large exclusion, meaning that if your estate is worth around $13.6 million or less, there is no estate tax to be paid. However, if your estate surpasses that amount, then anything over the exclusion amount will be subject to progressive tax rates, which go from 18% all the way up to 40%. Keep in mind that since the estate tax is applicable to the estate of the deceased, basically there is not much importance given to who your heirs are and where they are located. So your heirs can be non-US citizens or they can be US citizens, they can live in the US, not live in the US. And what really makes a difference is you as the owner of the estate, what your status is with regards to the US. So US citizens, you're always considered domiciled in the US. Green card holders, for the most part, you will consider to be domiciled with a few exceptions. The other thing that we have to consider is if you, by any chance, are a former US citizen. And this is where I want to get into some details that might surprise you. So let's say that you have decided in a very personal way that you no longer wish to be a citizen of the United States. You consider that maybe you disagree with certain policies, you believe that the United States is maybe heading in the wrong direction. Here at Nomad Capitalist, we do not encourage you to make one decision or the other. It is simply a very personal decision that each individual investor has to make for him or herself. Now, let's assume you did make that decision. Now, most of the people listening to this channel are obviously 6- and 7-figure entrepreneurs, and you will very likely have fallen into the category of a covered expatriate upon renouncing your US citizenship. So just as a very, very brief overview, you would be considered a covered expatriate if your net worth was $2 million or more, if you had an average income tax bill, which at today's rate was around $190,000. This is indexed for inflation, so you have to basically update it every year, but you have to look at the average for the past 5 years. And you could also potentially be considered a covered expat if you were not in compliance with US taxes at the time of your renunciation. So basically that, a lot of smaller details that have to be mentioned there, but this is a very general overview to give context. So let's assume you were a covered expat. You have left the United States, you've relocated, for example, to a tax-free jurisdiction like the Cayman Islands, Bahamas, SARC. Maybe you live in a non-dom country in Europe, and you've essentially parted ways with the United States. Okay, fair enough. What the US does is not only does it apply the exit tax, and in many cases you've heard us say the exit tax is basically the last chance the United States has to tax you before you officially leave the system, but this is not entirely true. So again, let's go to a practical example. Let's say John Smith renounces his US citizenship and he lives overseas in one of these countries I just mentioned, and his kids stay behind in the United States. And the children are still in the US, they're still living in the US, they're still full US citizens. And let's say John Smith passes away. Now, you would say, well, Javier, based on the rules you just explained, he is not a US citizen, he is not domiciled in the United States, therefore no estate tax is applicable on his global assets. And you would be right. Technically speaking, as a non-resident alien, he would only have to pay estate tax on US situs assets. That is correct. So for example, US real estate or US stocks. However, and here comes the shocker for most people, is that there is a special kind of inheritance tax. And I do use the quote signs here on purpose, because it is not officially called an inheritance tax, but it basically acts in the same way. When a former US citizen renounces his citizenship and is a covered expat, and his heirs are American domiciliaries and American citizens or green card holders, these heirs have to pay a substitute tax that replaces the estate tax that would have been paid by the deceased should he not have renounced his US citizenship. So essentially, if your heirs remain behind, they will be subject to a form of inheritance tax that replaces the US estate tax and that essentially adds a layer of taxation to your assets after your passing, even though you have renounced US citizenship. So that comes as a shocker to most people, and it's just a way to show how an aggressive tax authority will go to extreme lengths to make sure that you pay your taxes no matter what. Now, how can you avoid this like special inheritance tax on bequests and gifts and things that are inherited by US citizen heirs? Well, you can have your entire family renounced. That is always an option. If your heirs are no longer US citizens, then obviously this tax is not applicable. Or alternatively, you can leave more assets to your surviving spouse. There is an exception to this special tax for the surviving spouse. And so spouses can still inherit from former US citizens that are covered expats without triggering like this special type of inheritance tax. And please do not like officially call it that. I'm just using that term to make it more understandable in this video. And then the other alternative that we may potentially consider is if you feel generous enough, you can also leave your assets to a US charity. So a foundation based in the United States that maybe carries on a legacy or some kind of work that you consider important. Many of our clients here at Nomad Capitalist are extremely philanthropic, and philanthropy is very important to them. And so maybe leaving things to a US-based charity or foundation might also be an option, as charities or foundations would not be required to pay this special bequest tax or special sort of inheritance tax that substitutes the estate tax. So there you have it. This is a very general overview of an interesting topic for those of you mostly in your golden years planning wealth succession. So basically all of this is things that Nomad Capitalist can help you out with, help you understand. And if you want to learn more about trusts, estate planning, inheritance taxes, and how all this works and how all this comes together with expatriation, offshore tax, corporate structures, and things of that nature, then feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit the notification bell, follow us on Instagram, and visit our website, nomadcapitalist.com, so we can help you go where you're treated best and make sure your heirs receive the wealth you worked so hard to create.